It was 1 in the morning when I heard my daughter say I smelled like old garlic and cooking oil. She did not know I was there. She was standing in the kitchen. I had bought for her the one with the imported travertine floors and the hand-poured quartzite countertops in the $3.2 million home. I'd paid for it in full in cash with 40 years of 5 in the morning wake-up calls and hands that never once stopped working. I was standing 10 feet away in the dark hallway, completely still, the cold stone pressing up against my bare feet, listening to my own daughter's voice drift out from the bright kitchen and into the shadows, where I had been standing invisible like a stranger in a house I had written the check for. She was not angry when she said it. She was not even raising her voice. She was simply stating a fact, the way you might describe an old piece of furniture that no longer fits the room. If you have ever given everything you had to someone who called it nothing, hit like and subscribe. This one is for you. My name is Margaret Caldwell. Most people who know me call me Maggie. I'm 67 years old. I'm a widow, and I am the founder of Caldwell and Company Events, a luxury catering and event management business I built from a single folding table and a borrowed van in Scottsdale, Arizona, over the course of 4 decades. Before Scottsdale, there was Iowa, a young woman with $800 in a checking account and an absolute refusal to accept that her life would stay small. I drove west, I rented a commercial kitchen by the hour, and I started cooking. I cooked for corporate luncheons and charity galas, for debutante balls and 600 guest weddings at Sanctuary on Camelback Mountain. I built Caldwell and Company with blistered palms and the kind of stubbornness my late husband Thomas used to say was both my greatest strength and my most exhausting quality. Over time, the company became the most recognized name in upscale event catering across the entire Phoenix metro area. And for 38 years, Thomas was beside me for all of it. Then Thomas died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning in May, 18 months before the story begins. He was 69 years old. He was the most steadfast person I had ever known. And when he was gone, the silence inside our home became something I did not know how to live around. Our daughter Brianna, who was 34 at the time and renting a condo in North Scottsdale with her husband Chase, came to me with a proposal 6 weeks after the funeral. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, took my hand in hers, and told me she wanted us to be a real family again. She said she had found a property in Paradise Valley, an estate with a view of Camelback Mountain, a saltwater pool, native desert landscaping, and floors made from Italian travertine. She said the guest rooms were beautiful. She said I would never have to be lonely again. I believed her. I sold the home Thomas and I had shared for 22 years. I restructured a portion of my investment portfolio, and I wrote a check for $3.2 million and handed my daughter a life I had spent 4 decades building with my own 2 hands. I moved into the house 2 weeks after closing. The room I slept in was called the guest room. It had been 11 months. That was the last night I walked softly in anyone else's house. You deserve to know exactly what I heard in that kitchen, because what was said in the dark that night was not a slip. It was not exhaustion talking. It was the truth that had been living quietly underneath everything for a very long time, and I had simply never been awake at the right hour to catch it. It was 1:15 in the morning, July, in the Sonoran Desert, and the heat does not leave after dark in an Arizona summer, not really. The central air conditioning was running hard enough to rattle the vents, a low continuous roar like a truck idling just outside the walls. I had woken with a dry throat, the kind the desert air gives you when the humidity drops to nothing, and I was walking barefoot down the upstairs hallway toward the staircase, heading for the kitchen and a glass of cold water. The house was dark except for the light bleeding out from the kitchen below. Then I heard Brianna laugh, and then I heard Chase's voice, and then I heard my name. I stopped at the top of the stairs with one hand on the railing and the cold travertine under my feet, and I listened. Brianna was not whispering. She did not think she had an audience. She was describing me to her husband the way a person describes a problem they have been quietly tolerating for months. She said the smell of my cooking, the garlic, the olive oil, the bone broth I kept simmering on weekends was embedding itself into the walls, into the cushions, into the entire aesthetic she had spent 8 months carefully building for her social media platform. She said my presence in the house felt suffocating. She said I hovered. She said I did not belong in the frame she was trying to construct. She used the word liability, and then Chase spoke, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man saying something he had already decided a long time ago. He said that if he did not need my monthly pension deposits to keep the household running, he would have moved me into an assisted living facility 6 months earlier. I stood in the dark on the floor I had paid for and did not make a sound. I had spent 40 years feeding this city. I had cooked for governors and charity galas and 600 guests at a time. I had built something from nothing with nothing but my own determination and my own 2 hands. And the woman I had raised, a woman I had carried through every uncertain season of her young life, was standing in a house I had purchased in cash, embarrassed by the smell of those hands. I did not cry. I walked back upstairs, laid down in the dark, and I made a decision. The following morning, I let my shoulders drop. I shuffled into the kitchen in my worn slippers, lowered myself slowly onto a bar stool, and wrapped my hands around a coffee mug with the careful movements of a woman who found everything a little harder than it used to be. I told them in a quiet and uncertain voice that I had been thinking about retirement communities, that I did not want to be in the way, that perhaps it was time. The reaction was immediate, and it told me everything I needed to know. Brianna set her phone down. Chase straightened in his chair, and for one unguarded fraction of a second before the warmth came rushing back into both of their faces, I saw it. Not grief, panic. Ran across the kitchen and took my hand and told me I was the heart of this family. She made me an oat milk latte and slid it across the counter. Chase put his hand on my shoulder and told me I was never ever a burden. His hand was trembling, just slightly, just enough for someone who knew what to look for. I smiled and thanked them both, and I kept playing the part. 3 evenings later, Chase came to my room after dinner. He was carrying a thick manila folder and a gold pen, and he had the careful, measured voice of a man delivering something he wanted to appear generous. He called it a standard precaution, a simple power of attorney, he said, so he could step in and manage things if I was ever too tired or unwell to handle them myself. Just a formality, just a safety net. I reached for my reading glasses and opened the folder. I had negotiated contracts with 500 vendors over 40 years. I had managed payroll through a recession and rebuilt an entire client base after a catering disaster that would have ended a lesser company. I could read a legal document, and what I was reading was not a safety net. It was a transfer of everything I owned structured across 5 pages of dense, deliberately confusing language with a clause buried on page 5 in print so small I had to hold it close to the lamp, granting Chase the authority to commit me to a memory care facility and make all medical decisions on my behalf permanently without requiring my consent or the agreement of anyone else. My son-in-law had just handed me a document designed to erase me from my own life, and he was sitting there with a gold pen and a patient smile waiting for me to sign it. I set the folder down gently and pressed my fingers to my temples. I told him the legal language always gave me a headache. I told him I would read it carefully over the weekend. I handed him back the pen, and for just a fraction of a second before his expression settled back into something pleasant, I watched his mask slip. His eyes went cold and hard, the way eyes go when the calculation underneath them is exposed. Then he stood and said, "Of course," and wished me a good evening. He did not say good night. 2 days after that, I came downstairs at 10 minutes to 8 in the evening to find my 6-year-old granddaughter Harper sitting alone on the kitchen floor. She had dragged a step stool over to the pantry and climbed up to reach a box of Cheerios on the high shelf, and she was sitting cross-legged on the cold travertine, eating them dry from a cracked plastic bowl with the quiet and patient focus of a child who has done this before and does not expect anything different. The house was empty around her. No chef, no dinner, no one. I crouched beside her and asked why she was eating cereal. She looked up at me with her bright eyes and explained in the matter-of-fact voice of a child simply reporting the facts of her world that Mommy said they were very poor right now, and that the chef had been cancelled, and that it would just be cereal and sandwiches until Daddy got rich again. I was still kneeling on that floor when I heard the front door swing open. Brianna's heels crossed the marble foyer in a sharp, confident rhythm. She came into the kitchen and set 4 Gucci shopping bags down on the quartzite countertop with a heavy thud no more than 2 feet from Harper's cracked bowl, and immediately started talking about a luncheon and a boutique and a personal shopper who had pulled exclusive pieces for an upcoming gala. She barely glanced at her daughter. I looked at the bags. I looked at Harper. I looked at the bags again. That was the moment I stopped mourning the daughter I had raised, and started planning. Planning for a woman who had run a company for 40 years. Always started with the numbers. On Saturday morning, I put on my navy blazer, took my keys from the hook by the side door, and drove my 8-year-old Subaru Outback into Scottsdale to my bank. Richard, the branch manager who had handled my business accounts for 22 years, stood up when he saw me come through the glass doors the way he always did. But when I asked him to pull the full transaction history on the education trust I had set up for Harper the month she was born, he sat back down without smiling, and he turned the screen toward me without a word. The trust had held $380,000. The remaining balance was $147, not $147,000. $147. Every withdrawal had been authorized by Chase Holloway, transferred in amounts between $25,000 and $50,000, routed every 2 weeks to the same destination, an entity called Cascade Capital Partners LLC. $380,000, built over a lifetime of early mornings and aching feet. Gone into an account I had never once heard of, to pay for a life built entirely on lies. I folded the bank statement, placed it inside my blazer pocket, thanked Richard, and walked out to my car. I sat in the parking lot with the Arizona heat pressing against every window, and gave myself exactly as long as it took the air conditioning to reach the back seat. Then I drove to North Scottsdale. Fran Delgado had been my accountant and closest professional ally for 25 years. I called her from the parking lot and asked if we could meet that evening after hours side entrance. She was already there when I arrived, along with a young attorney she trusted. The three of us sat around her conference table with the blinds drawn and the door locked, and Fran traced Cascade Capital Partners through corporate registration records in under 40 minutes. Shell Company incorporated in Nevada 16 months ago. Chase Holloway, the sole beneficiary of its holding accounts. Every real estate deal he had claimed was in progress had already collapsed. Brianna's wellness brand had generated no real revenue in over a year. Chase owed $175,000 to Oft, or betting platforms, and a private lender who had recently stopped being patient. Every dollar Harper had ever been promised was gone, spent on debts and on an image that had always been built on nothing. I sat across from Fran and looked at the numbers on her screen. It was the kind of betrayal that does not make you cry. It makes you go very, very still. The next morning, I stopped at a security equipment shop on the edge of Old Town Scottsdale and paid cash for a voice-activated micro-recorder no larger than a matchbook. I drove home, put on my cardigan, and knocked on Chase's office door. I told him I was looking for my old Julia Child cook, book one I thought I might have left on his bookshelf months ago. He barely looked up from his phone. I moved slowly along the bookshelves, murmuring to myself, and when I let a heavy book slip from my hands to the carpet and crouched down to retrieve it, I pressed the recorder against the underside of the custom walnut desk I had paid $12,000 to have built for him as a congratulatory gift the day he opened his home office. He bought the desk with my money. I bought it back with evidence. 2 days later, I walked to a city park 3 blocks from the house and sat on a bench in the thin shade of a desert willow tree. It was 3 in the afternoon. The temperature was 108 degrees. To the west, the sky had already begun to darken with a deep red-brown wall of an approaching haboob, the mess of dust storms that roll in from the Sonoran Desert during monsoon season and erase the horizon in minutes. I put in my earbuds and opened the audio application on my phone, and I listened. What I heard in Brianna's own voice and in Chase's own voice was a plan they had already decided on. A sedative compound obtained through a doctor who no longer held a valid license to practice medicine, colorless and odorless and undetectable in a standard blood panel. A few drops dissolved into my chamomile tea each evening. Memory loss within days. Then visible tremors. Then a fraudulent house call assessment by the unlicensed doctor producing documentation of rapid onset dementia. With that paperwork, the power of attorney I had refused to sign would become legally enforceable without my consent. Brianna laughed when Chase finished laying it out. It was not a nervous laugh. It was the easy open laugh of someone who believes the hardest part is already behind her. I pulled the earbuds out. A young mother walked past pushing a stroller. The baby inside reached one small hand toward me and opened and closed its fingers. I lifted my hand and waved back. Above us, the wall of Sonoran dust continued its steady march toward the city. I was not angry anymore. I was something colder than that. I was decided. Over the following 48 hours, Fran and the attorney moved every liquid asset I held into an irrevocable blind trust, removing them entirely from my personal name and placing them beyond anyone's reach. I also shared with them something Brianna and Chase had never once been told. The Paradise Valley property had been purchased through an entity called MC Holdings LLC, a private company I alone controlled. Their names had never appeared on the deed. They had never been homeowners. They had been tenants who had never been told that was what they were. I instructed the attorney to list the property for immediate cash sale. Then I went home, settled into the living room armchair, and waited. Chase brought the chamomile tea in on a small tray that evening, warm and fragrant, and carrying something I had no intention of drinking. I wrapped both hands around the cup and let them tremble for his benefit. The moment he turned and crossed the room to retrieve the signing pen, I poured every drop into the soil of the small potted cigar standing in the corner of the room. He came back and placed the power of attorney document on my lap. I picked up the pen and signed my name in a slow and steady scrawl, barely readable, the signature of a woman whose hands were no longer reliable. Chase looked at it for a moment. Then he smiled wide and certain, the smile of a man who has just won everything he came for. He did not know the vaults were already empty. He did not know the house had already been sold. And he had no idea that the expression on my face was not surrender. It was patience. The charity gala was held on a Friday evening at a resort in North Scottsdale that I knew the way you know a place where you have spent thousands of hours of your working life. Caldwell and Company had catered there for 12 consecutive years. I knew the kitchen lay at the loading dock in every corner of that ballroom. I also knew the young man working the bar on the far right side of the room, a man named Tyler, who had worked his first event with me as a college sophomore and had spent the better part of a decade learning his craft on my watch. When Brianna and Chase guided me to a chair in the darkest corner of the room, I could see from across the space that Tyler recognized something was wrong. He had watched me run rooms like this one for years. He knew what I looked like when I was in charge, and he knew this was not it. I sat in that corner with my shoulders rounded and my hands folded quietly in my lap, my gaze soft and distant, the portrait of a woman whose thoughts had traveled somewhere unreachable. Chase moved through the crowd with the effortless warmth of a man completely comfortable among people he was deceiving. He brought a group of investors near my chair at one point and gestured in my direction with the practiced sorrow of a devoted son managing a quiet family tragedy. He said that caring for his mother-in-law had taken everything they had, but that family always came first. The men around him nodded slowly. On the other side of the room, Tyler watched without moving. His eyes found mine across the distance and held for a moment, asking a question he could not say out loud. I looked back at him. Then I placed both hands on the arms of the chair and stood up, not slowly, not carefully. I straightened to my full height, pulled my shoulders back, and walked out of that dark corner the way I had walked into every room I had ever owned, with purpose and without any apology at all. The ballroom went quiet with the particular silence of a crowd that understands without being told that something has just changed. I walked to the low glass table at the center of the room and set down the manila folder from inside my jacket. I spoke without raising my voice because I had spent 4 decades projecting into large spaces, and I had never once needed volume to be heard. I told them there was no real estate portfolio, no functional wellness brand, no investment deal moving toward close. What there was a college trust account I had spent 20 years building for a 6-year-old girl named Harper, $380,000 drained to $147 by her own father and wired into a shell company to cover gambling debts. Then I took out my phone and pressed play. Brianna's voice filled the room, clear and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had believed she was having a private conversation, saying that once the sedatives had done their work, they would place me in a state facility, liquidate everything I had ever built, and never have to see my face again. The room held its breath. I looked at my daughter across the ballroom. She reached for the edge of the table beside her and did not find it. The following morning came with a process server at the front door and 2 police vehicles in the gravel driveway. Chase was taken out in handcuffs on charges of embezzlement from a dependents' trust account. By midday, through an emergency family court order, Harper was placed in my care. I put her in the passenger seat of my Subaru with one bag and her favorite stuffed rabbit, and I did not look back once as we drove away from Paradise Valley. We went north up through the switchbacks of Oak Creek Canyon, where the road narrows and the ponderosa pines close overhead, and the air shifts from hot and dry to something cooler and alive. When the red rocks of Sedona appeared through the windshield for the first time, Harper pressed her face against the glass and said, "They looked like they were on fire." I told her she was not wrong. The cabin had belonged to Thomas and me for many years, a place we came to remember what mattered. Now it held something new. On our first morning together, we sat side by side on the wood veranda and watched the sunrise move across Cathedral Rock, the sandstone traveling slowly through colors that have no good names, deep orange first, then a bruised and smoky purple, that a gold that seems to rise from inside the stone rather than from the sky above it. Below the ridge, Oak Creek ran steadily over smooth rock, that clean and constant sound that asks nothing of you and gives everything back. Harper had a bowl of warm oatmeal I had made from scratch, topped with fresh blueberries from a farm stand on the drive up. Not dry cereal, not a cracked plastic bowl on a cold stone floor. A real breakfast made by someone with time to make it, and the will to always make it. She reached over and took my hand in both of hers and turned it over slowly, studying the texture of my palm the way children study things they're genuinely curious about. She asked me why my hands felt the way they did. I looked down at them. I thought about every morning I had started before light, every event I had stayed until midnight to close. I thought about the trust account I had built dollar by dollar across 20 years, and the small person sitting beside me who it was always meant for. I told her it was because these hands had never stopped working for her, not once. She nodded as if that settled something, leaned back in her chair, and went back to her oatmeal. I gave Brianna everything I had, everything except the one thing I truly owed her as her mother, which was the honest truth that love without any limits is not love at all. It is permission. Permission to take and take again without ever understanding what it costs the person giving. I will not make that mistake again. Not with Harper. Harper set down her bowl and pointed at the sky. The red rocks of Sedona were burning orange, then gold, then something. I do not have words for that color that only exists in the high desert at the exact moment the world decides to begin again. I had no idea what the road ahead would ask of me, but I was sitting next to my granddaughter in the clear morning air with the smell of breakfast still warm between us. And for the first time in 2 years, I was finally home. Thank you for sitting with me through the story. If it touched something real in you, if you have ever had to stand up for yourself when someone you loved forgot who you were, please share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not already, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories on the way, and I promise every single one of them is worth staying for.